سلام بچه‌ها، خیلی خوش اومدیم به جلسه سوممون. توی این جلسه قراره یکی دیگه از فصول بسیار مهم کتاب آقای پرین رو بررسی کنیم در مورد بحث پلات. یه اوورویو بهتون بدم از آنچه که در طول این جلسه در موردش صحبت خواهیم کرد. ابتدا سعی می‌کنیم که راجع به یه تفاوت خیلی مهم راجع به دو تا کیوردی که معمولاً اشتباه گرفته میشن با هم دیگه، یعنی پلات و استوری، راجع به تفاوت این دوتا با هم دیگه صحبت خواهیم کرد. بعدش یکم دقیق‌تر خود لفظ پلات رو با هم دیگه تعریف و بررسی می‌کنیم. راجع به اجزای مختلفش با هم دیگه صحبت می‌کنیم که پلات از چه چیزهایی تشکیل شده و بعد یکم با جزئیات بیشتر راجع به تعدادی از این بخش‌های مختلف با هم دیگه صحبت خواهیم کرد. در جاهایی حتما به مثال هم خواهیم پرداخت، ولی خب بعد از اینکه این ویدیو رو نگاه کردین قطعا خودتون هم باید بریم و فصل مربوط به پلات رو بخونین، چون اونجا خیلی با جزئیات بیشتر و مثال‌های بهتر از داستان The Most Dangerous Game که جلسه گذشته راجبش صحبت کردیم به صورت آنلاین، اونجا کلی خب مطلب ریز و جزئی‌تر هست که میتونیم با خوندنش به درک بهتری از داستان ریچارد کانال برسیم The Most Dangerous Game. پس بریم و جلسه امروزمون رو شروع کنیم در مورد پلات و structure. Okay, so one of the most important things for you to keep in mind as a student of English literature is that today we are talking about probably one of the most fundamental elements of fiction, which is plot, which in other words is what happens in the story. However, one of the important issues to keep in mind whenever we are discussing the issue of plot is the difference between what we call plot and what we call story. Now, a lot of people use these two terms interchangeably, which means that they believe there is no significant difference between these two words. However, serious students of literature should know that there is a very, very important difference between these two keywords, and that's what we are going to do in the first slide of this presentation today. Our discussion here is based on a very famous book by the famous novelist and critic E.M. Forster called The Aspects of the Novel. Now, in Aspects of the Novel, E.M. Forster talks about the difference between story and plot. According to Forster and many other literary critics, a story is a series of events recorded in their chronological order. So if you talk about, for example, the order of the events, chronologically speaking, you are talking about a story. So a story is the list of the events which happen in, for example, fiction, based on a time frame. What happened first, then what happened after that, after that, after that, until we get to the final action. However, plot is a little bit more complex. Plot is again a series of events. However, we use plot for a special arrangement of events. A special arrangement which has been deliberately done by the writer so as to reveal the dramatic, thematic, or the emotional significance of those events. So, we can say that a story is like history, just a series of facts written or, for example, recorded one after the other. However, plot is when for example, a writer tries to use his genius in order to arrange these events in a way so that it can arouse certain feelings, for example, in the reader, so that the readers realize, wow, that event is thematically significant. If we didn't know about that event, the meaning of the, for example, work would disappear or fade away. Or, for example, if we are talking about a story, we say, okay, well, somebody died. And that's one of the events in the story. But a plot tells you about that death in a way that you understand the emotional significance of that death for the person to which the incident occurred or happened. So that's the difference between the story and plot. And Forster has an example in his book. He says, well, the king died and the queen died too, for example. So if you look at this one, this is an example for the story because we are talking about uh, a series of chronological events. First, the king died, and then after that, the queen died. However, imagine that a writer wants to turn this story into a plot. In the plot, we have the same sentence, but we have the emotional significance of it too. Uh, the king died, and then the queen died of grief. Adding these two words to the basic story events gives you an extra layer of significance, which, as we said, could be dramatic, thematic, or emotional. So that's the difference between plot and story, and I want you to know this because it is absolutely essential to our discussion today. So let's define plot in more details. So, as we know by now, our plot is the sequence of incidents or events of which the story is composed. And it may also include, for example, what the characters say or what the characters think. However, don't forget that the plot is also concerned with major events. So, just like the story, yes, the plot is also concerned with major events or happenings. But the difference between them is the arrangement, how that arrangement creates an emotional impact. Because later on, when you start reading, for example, serious works of literature, you sometimes realize that, for example, a story begins in the middle of the action. So, and then we have a flashback which tells you when the story started or how it started. And then we might have, for example, some flash forward to see how the story is going to end. Again, if you look at some movies, for example, you also realize that sometimes movies start at the end of the action. And then, step by step, the director, for example, goes back, traces the steps, and tells you when the original action started and what kinds of events led to this special conclusion. So, this masterful manipulation and changing of the order of the events in order to create an emotional effect on the reader or, for example, on the viewer is what the plot is all about. Now, unfortunately, again, when we are talking about the plot, the issue of mature and immature or inexperienced readers, so the issue of these two different types of readers again arises. Immature readers read only and chiefly for plot, for the incidents. They are only concerned with what happens next. They are concerned with the events and the major happenings. However, mature readers, when they try to write a piece of fiction, they are more interested in the revelations of character or life that those events represent or reveal. So, yes, mature readers also read those events, but they are more interested in learning the significance of those events. So, that's the difference between mature and immature readers. Immature readers only want the action to happen, but mature readers try to go beyond the mere surface or the facade of the events to understand what lies behind them, to understand what that event can tell us about the character or about the life in general. So, in any good story, there should be some action, otherwise, the story cannot go forward. However, Great stories are those that use those, for example, actions, physical actions, in order to give you a maximum amount of insight into the character or life in general. So, as I told you, every story needs action. Every fiction, every piece of literature needs action. However, what differentiates a good story and a bad story is the level of significance. Good stories are full of significant action. The action is not there just for the sake of itself. The action is there because it reveals something important. Okay, and as I've written here for you, and this is a direct quote, of course, from the book, for a mature reader, a discerning reader, a reader who's careful enough, sometimes a tiny little bit of action, which other readers deem insignificant, can have a great meaning. Like, for example, a seemingly insignificant event, like, for example, a handshake, can mean something. So, if you are a careful reader, you are always looking for deeper meanings. However, let me just warn you right here that you should be careful of over interpretation. This is one of the traps which await you as a serious student of literature. Because when we teach students that you should be a discerning reader. You should always look for the significance of an action. Unfortunately, one of the drawbacks of this message is that they always think that there is a hidden meaning behind even tiny little actions. No, that's not the case. So you should be careful. And as you move forward in your education, as you become more experienced, you realize which parts of the story should be read meticulously, carefully, and which parts of the story should be left alone. You should just move on and not worry about any significantly hidden meaning behind a simple action. And that comes only with experience. So, after defining plot, let's talk about a very famous uh, diagram, which was suggested by a famous literary critic called Freytag. Now, Freytag suggested that every good story has different kinds of elements, and those kinds of elements take the story forward, are actually the force behind the movement of the action in the story. Now, Freytag believed that stories which follow this pyramid can be called great stories, but that's not always true. We can also have, for example, commercial or cheap or escapist fiction, which follows all of these uh, incidents and, for example, all of these elements, but ends up being again commercial fiction. But we also, on the other hand, have some interpretive or literary fiction, which doesn't follow some of these elements, doesn't include some of these elements, but still ends up being a great piece of literature. So, once again, the quality of being commercial, the issue of being commercial fiction or literary fiction, the issue of being escapist or interpretive fiction does not really lie in, for example, following this pyramid. It's again about the significance of all of these actions. If they are significant, yes, we can call it interpretive or literary fiction. But let's talk about this because this is a very important piece of information whenever we discuss plot. Now, Freitag tells us that every great story begins with exposition. An exposition is usually مقدمه چینی. So we introduce the setting, we introduce the characters, so that we know whom we are dealing with. به عنوان مثال اگه بخوایم داستان مثلا میگم داستان معروف الان چیزی که تو ذهنم باشه داستان معروف مثلا هاکلبری فین، رمان بسیار یکی از رمان‌های مورد علاقه خودم. رمان معروف هاکلبری فین رو بررسی کنیم اثر آقای توین. میتونیم در مورد اکسپوزیشن یا مقدمه چینیش بگیم معرفی شخصیت هاک و همچنین مثلا ویدو داگلاس که اول رمان ما داریم که هاک که مثلا پدر ایناش ولش کردن و تقریبا یتیمه، ویدو داگلاس اینو به سرپرستی قبول کرده و حالا میخواد که مثلا هاک رو پیش خودش نگه داره. Then of course we have the inciting incident. The inciting incident is the kind of action or incident that sets the story in motion. ما تا الان با یه چیز توصیفی سر و کار داشتیم توی بحث اکسپوزیشن، ولی یه اتفاقی رخ میده که موتور محرکه داستانه و حرکت داستان رو شروع میکنه به سمت اون نقطه اوجش. پس inciting accident یا incident اتفاقیه که اون موتور محرکه داستانه. باز اگر به رمان هاکلبری فین توجه کنیم، اونجایی که پدر هاکلبری فین پپ برمیگرده و میگه نه من میخوام هاک رو پیش خودم بزرگ کنم و اینو میخوام با خودم ببرم تو اون کلبه‌ای که توی جنگل دارم. این باعث شروع یک سری اتفاقات مهم توی داستان میشه که کم کم بریم به سمت نقطه عطف داستان. So that's the inciting incident. Then we have the rising action. The rising action is what happens next after that initial inciting incident and takes the story even more forward towards the climax. Again, in the story of Huckleberry Finn, when Huck tries to run away with Jim, the black slave, that's the rising action which take the story even forward and forward. Then we have complication. Complication means when suddenly something happens which makes the situation even more complex, makes the situation even worse. So, for example, again, in the story of Huckleberry Finn, Huck and Jim come across two charlatans who introduce themselves to be like kings and dukes. And then Huck, because he's very young, and Jim, because he's just this illiterate person, usually cannot really discern between people who lie or people who tell the truth. And unfortunately, they trust them. But the king and the duke, who are charlatans, who have put on mere facades of being, for example, from the royal family, try to, for example, steal from Huck and Jim, try to, for example, reveal their identities. For example, they try to tell everyone that Jim is a runaway slave and then he needs to be returned to his previous owners. So that's the complication. The climax of the story is when for example, Jim is in a predicament. A new family has claimed the life of Jim, has claimed the ownership of Jim, and now Huck realizes that Jim's life is in danger. So he has kind of two options. Again, he has one option to write a letter to Widow Douglas and tell him where Jim is, because, well, Jim used to work there. But in that case, Jim would be enslaved again. But the other option for Huck is to try to escape with Jim, try to free Jim again, and then they can escape once again. And that's the climax of the story that Huck says, okay, if I lie, if I try to, for example, free Jim, I might be condemned to hell. And keep in mind that Huck is a very young kid and he has had this serious upbringing that you shouldn't lie, you shouldn't you shouldn't violate the law. And then because the law in that period was in a way that people could have slaves, Jim is thinking, Huck is thinking, oh my God, what am I going to do? Am I going to break the law? Am I going to, for example, lie because of for example, a black slave? But then Huck sort of finds an epiphany, experiences an epiphany, a serious change, and he says, okay, I think that if I write a letter and tell them where Jim is so that Jim is a slave again, it's a terrible thing to do. So I'm going to go to hell for Jim. یعنی که من حاضرم هیچی نگم، لوش ندم، خودم دوباره آزادش کنم، قانون رو بشکنم و برم جهنم، ولی کاری که درسته رو انجام بدم. So that's the climax of the story. Now, after that, we have a reversal. So the reversal is when, for example, they free Jim and they want to continue their journey on the Amazon River. Uh, so that's the reversal and the falling action when Huck and his friend Tom Sawyer they liberate Jim, but then of course, unfortunately, he's recaptured again. Um, so when we come to the resolution of the story, we have a difficult decision for Huck to make. Uh, for example, he can decide to go home and stay home with, for example, Widow Douglas again, or for example, Huckleberry Finn can decide to run away. And so the resolution of the story is somehow the falling action, and the resolution of the story is somehow Huck deciding that once again he wants to run away. And the denouement, which is a French word which means the conclusion of the story, is when, for example, Widow Douglas adopts. So, what's the conclusion? What happens at the end? It's when Widow Douglas adopts Huck and then tries to civilize Huck again. So that's an example of what happens if we follow Freytag's pyramid and apply it, for example, to a story like Huckleberry Finn. But this kind of plot analysis is not really effective. I will talk about this later on in my lecture, but just keep in mind that just enumerating different parts of the story, okay, this is the, for example, exposition, this is the inciting incident, this is the rising action, this is the falling action, this is the revolution. This is not an effective analysis in literary studies, because what you are doing is just telling me different kinds of actions that exist in the story, in the novel. So we need to be careful about some other elements of plot which also exist, which can make our analysis more fruitful, more give it more depth. So that's why in the next part of the presentation, we are going to talk about other elements of the plot, which can add an extra layer to our superficial analysis of plot based on Freytag's pyramid. But this is also very, very important. So I want you to memorize this. مثلا امکان داره توی امتحان بهتون بگم که هرم فرایتگ رو اپلای کنین روی داستان The Most Dangerous Game. خب قاعدتا میتونین اینطوری به این روشی که من در مورد رمان ماجراهای هاکلبری فین بهتون گفتم شما هم اونجا اجرا کنین این قضیه رو. But as we said, every plot has other elements too, which are worthy of attention. In fact, they might even be more important than Freytag's pyramid, but not by a large margin, which means that they are equally important. And we have to look at both sides of this kind of analysis. So a very, very important and one of the most essential elements of every plot is the conflict. At the end of my presentation, I will also tell you that probably finding the conflict is a good first step for your analysis, for your literary analysis. Why? Because the plot tells you what the whole story is about. Because the conflict tells you what the whole story is about. So, as we said, one of the central elements of the plot in fiction is the conflict. And because we have the word conflict, well, obviously we know that in every conflict there are two parties involved. The main character, whether we sympathize with him or not, is the protagonist. Now, the book also tells you that please do not use the term hero, because hero is quite vague. When we say hero, some people think that that person should have some heroic qualities, should have supernatural qualities, should be bigger than life. Like for example, the heroes of epic, like for example, Achilles, right? In for example, the Iliad and the Odyssey. Like for example, Odysseus in again Homer's epics. We are not, when we use the term hero to describe, for example, the main character, it becomes quite vague for some people because, as I said, they think that that person should be greater than life. So that's why we use the term protagonist. So the protagonist is the main character of the story, and like all of the accidents usually revolve around this person. The forces pitted against the protagonist, those forces which try to prevent the protagonist from achieving what he desires or what she desires, those forces are called the antagonists of the story. Now, antagonists can be people, can be other things too. We will talk about it here in this section, but just keep in mind that every story usually has a protagonist and an antagonist. And an antagonist sometimes can be, for example, the person himself, his psyche, his own mind, which, for example, prevents him from achieving success. So antagonists can be different things. Okay, we are not just talking about people here, and that's why I've written forces. All of those forces which are working against the protagonist are called the antagonist. So when we already know who the parties are and what the parties of every conflict are, now let's talk about the conflict itself. Now, conflicts can be physical, like a person might be physically fighting with other people, but it also can be mental conflict, right? It can be an emotional conflict, especially when a person is trying to deal with, let's say, a breakup, which is quite emotional. Or it can be a moral conflict. A person is trapped in a dilemma. He doesn't know what to choose because both options are undesirable for that person. And so conflicts can be all kinds of things: physical, mental, emotional, or moral. The opponents or the antagonists can also be different. For example, in some cases, in some stories, we have man against man, which means that the protagonist is a man, is a person, and the antagonist is another person. So we have, for example, sword fights. We have, for example, like in Western movies, we have a duel, a gunfight between two people. That's the conflict in which man is fighting against man. But man can also be, for example, portrayed against the environment around him, against the society in general, against fate. So that's, for example, another form of conflict when, for example, man is fighting against the environment. Another one, which is probably the most, let's say, sophisticated one of them, and one which a lot of literary writers prefer, is when man is put against himself, when he has some internal conflicts which he needs to resolve in order to do something. So, this kind of internal conflict is usually found in serious literary fiction. But for example, a lot of escapist fiction prefer this one because a lot of immature writers only prefer to have, for example, gunfights and sword fights, etc. So just be careful that this is not, again, this is not 100% true about all kinds of literary or commercial fiction. نکته ای که باید بهش توجه داشته باشید اینه که واقعا نمیشه اینطوری مرز بندی کرد بگیم تمامی داستان‌های اسکیپ یا کامرشال تقابل انسان با انسانه، نه. یا اینکه مثلا تمامی داستان‌های ادبی جدی حتما داره اینترنال کانفلیکت هستن، نه. خیلی از آثار بزرگ جهان با تمامی اینها نوشته شدن. پس باز همون نکته‌ای که در ابتدا اشاره کردم این که سیگنیفیکنس اتفاقات خیلی مهمتر از خود اتفاقاته. اینجا باز هم باید بهش اشاره کنم. اگه میخواین ببینین که تحلیل این چطوری میشه، الان میتونین برین کتاب رو بخونین. البته حتما باید کتاب رو بخونین، چه این لکچر من رو گوش بدین تا آخر چه نه، چون خب قطعا یه سری سوالات به صورت کاملا تکستوال از متن خواهد اومد. اما خود کتاب توضیح داده که مثلا یه داستانی مثل The Most Dangerous Game همه اینا رو داره. مثلا تقابل رینسفورد و زاراف من اگینست منه، اونجایی که رینسفورد میفته تو دریا و باید شنا کنه خودش رو به جزیره برسونه میشه من اگینست environment. اونجایی که رینسفورد داره کم میاره ولی هی به خودش داره میگه نه من باید ادامه بدم من میتونم، اونجا داره با ذهن خودش که داره اون قسمتی از ذهنش که بهش میگه اون ترس ها و قسمت های محدود کننده ذهنش که دارن بهش میگن بی خیال ول کن بذار کشته بشی راحت چی، داره با اون مبارزه میکنه، اونم میشه مثلا man against himself. So some stories can have only one form of conflict, but there are stories which have all different kinds of conflicts in them. So as I said, we can say that in commercial fiction or in escapist fiction, the conflict is usually between man and man because readers want it. And however, what is significant here is that the boundaries are clear cut. The boundaries are clearly defined for us. We know which group represents good and which group represents evil. So this kind of binary opposition between the forces of good and the forces of evil is very easy to discern and understand and point out. However, in interpretive fiction or literary fiction, sometimes we have good, which is fighting another form of good. Or we sometimes the story is written in a way that we as readers find it quite difficult to determine which one represents good and which one represents evil. So those are the qualities which make a great piece of fiction. And also, as we said, if we want to choose one form of conflict which is more popular among serious literary writers, we can say that internal conflict is usually preferred because we always try to ponder life, we always try to think about life. And these kinds of internal conflicts in which the character has to deal with some internal and mental issues so that he can finally, for example, come to an understanding. A deeper understanding of life is more preferable, uh, especially in literary fiction. So, having talked about conflict in literature, it's time we talked about another element of plot which is also significant for us, and that's the element of suspense. We've also talked about suspense in the previous session, but suspense is that quality in fiction which uh, keeps you on the edge of your seat and makes you ask questions like this: hey, what's going to happen next? I want to know what the fate of the character is. What's going to happen to him? So that quality of fiction is called suspense. Usually in TV shows, suspense is created by introducing cliffhangers at the end of every episode. Now, a cliffhanger is a kind of situation in which, for example, a sympathetic character is in danger and we want to know what's going to happen to him. For example, a sympathetic character is tied to a railroad and a train is approaching that part of the railroad. And suddenly the TV show ends. And that's a cliffhanger because we don't know what's going to happen to this character. Is somebody going to save that person? Or is the train going to smash into this body which has been bound to the track? So that's kind of a cliffhanger. Or like people of my generation who grew up with Captain Tsubasa, the anime. Uh, Now I remember we were watching the anime, and then Captain Tsubasa with who would like fly into the sky for example, a bicycle shot would take the shot, and then the ball took forever to reach the goal. And suddenly, when the ball reached the goal line, suddenly for example, the TV show, the episode would end, and we would be dying to know if he was going to score or not. So that's kind of also a cliffhanger. So cliffhangers keep you guessing what's going to happen next. Now, suspense, as the book says, is greatest, of course, when the reader's curiosity about what's going to happen next is tied or combined with the anxiety that the reader feels about the fate of a character. So, in the example of, for example, the hero or the heroine being tied to the tracks, and, for example, a train approaching the body, this is a good kind of suspense in a way because uh, our curiosity is completely tied with the fate of the main character or the sympathetic character. Another example, another way, so one way of creating suspense is using cliffhangers. Another way of creating suspense is whodunit mysteries. Now, this usually happens in detective fiction, like, for example, Agatha Christie's Poirot, or, for example, Arthur Conan Doyle's Sherlock Holmes, or, for example, other kinds of characters, like, for example, Detective Dupin by a fictional character created by Edgar Allan Poe, or other famous, for example, detectives in the history of movies and, of course, literature. So the suspense in whodunit novels, as the name suggests, lies in the fact that we don't know who the killer is, and therefore we keep reading to find out who the perpetrator is, who the criminal is. And that's another way of creating suspense. However, well, again, that's some sort of commercial fiction, and more sophisticated detective fiction is usually like, for example, a psychological thriller. Uh, for these kinds of sophisticated detective stories, usually tell you right from the beginning who the killer is and what motivates you as the reader or the viewer to continue watching or reading is the fact that you are more concerned with the motives. What motivated the killer to do these killings? I recently started watching a new uh, detective TV show called Des. It's a British show, and it's about this killer who kills like homeless people, and he has killed 15 or 16 of them. And like 20 minutes into the first episode, they tell you who the killer is and they arrest him. But what keeps me motivated to continue watching this TV show is because I really want to know why he chose his victims among young men who were usually homeless, who were living in poverty on the streets, right? So these kinds of stories in which the question is not what happens, but rather why it happens, are called whodunits, which, as I said, is a more literary form of detective fiction, which in itself is somehow commercial or escapist. So, how can we create suspense? Like, what is the technique? We know that, for example, we can use cliffhangers, we can use, for example, whodunit schemes in order to create suspense. But we also have some tangible, concrete techniques, which, for example, we can use as writers to create suspense in a work of fiction. One method is to use an element of mystery. When, for example, we have a mysterious, weird, or serious, or, for example, strange situation for which an explanation is not readily accessible, which, in other words, means that we have a weird situation and the reader really wants to know why the situation is like this, but an explanation for that situation is not offered by the writer. And this kind of mysteriousness, this kind of mystery creates suspense because we want to understand it. Another tangible, for example, technique for the creation of suspense is to put the characters in a dilemma. A dilemma is a situation in which you have two options to choose from, but both options are unfortunately unfavorable and so undesirable. And so the character doesn't really know which one to choose. A very good example of this is a philosophical problem and conundrum. یه از اون سوالات فلسفی هست که نشون دهنده این دیلماست. میگه فرض کن شما توی یک اتاق کنترل یک ریل راهن نشستی، یک قطاری داره به سرعت به سمت یه ریلی میره که 5 تا آدم روش گیر کردن و هر لحظه امکان داره بهشون بخوره و اون 5 تا آدم بمیرن. تویی که داخل اتاق کنترل هستی یه دونه لور، یه دونه دستگیره داری که با کشیدن اون دستگیره میتونی مسیر قطار رو به سمت یک ریل دیگه‌ای ببری که اونجا فقط یک نفر وایساده. همچین چیزی رو بهش میگن دیلما. چرا؟ چون در هر صورت انسانی کشته خواهد شد. حالا این البته میگم این سوال فلسفی اصلا بک‌گراند خیلی عظیمی داره که الان وقتش نیست بهش بپردازیم، ولی میگه خب اگه تو باشی کدومش رو انتخاب میکنی؟ میذاری قطاره بره همونطوری که اون 5 نفر رو بکشه، یا اینکه نه اون دستگیره رو میکشی که بین بد و بدتر مثلا بره و یه نفر رو بکشه؟ که خب میگم هر دو طرفش رو میشه جواب داد. یکی اینکه خب جون 4 نفر و 5 نفر رو نجات دادن که در مقابل فقط یه نفر کشته بشه ارجحیت داره، ولی بعضیا میگن بحث ایجنسی مطرحه. یعنی اینکه خب قطار که در هر صورت داره میره، من اگر اون یعنی من وقتی که اون 5 نفر بمیرن من مسئولش نبودم، ولی اگه من دستگیره رو بکشم و کار عمدی انجام بدم و مسیر قطار رو عوض کنم، قاعدتا من مسئول کشتن اون یک نفر هستم و خب اونجا من مقصرم و من مسئولیت دارم. که خب حالا میگم از اون دیلماها و سوالات فلسفیه که خیلی نمیشه جواب معینی براش پیدا کرد، ولی خب this is an example, this is a good example of what a dilemma is all about. So the book tells us that of course suspense is overrated, which means that only immature or inexperienced readers want suspense all the time, because we all have read certain works of fiction which do not really have any suspense in them, but still they are great. And that's why we believe that it is overrated. Because again, as the book says, one of the tests that you can perform on a story to see if it is good, if it is a good story or not, is again whether or not it creates a desire in you to read it again. And if it creates that desire in you, it is a good story because you already know what's going to happen at the end, and so the suspense is completely meaningless and irrelevant here. So again, once again, when we say, for example, the journey is more important than the destination, right? That can also be applied here. That for example, ending is not really important. The suspense that keeps us motivated to understand what's going to happen next is not really important. We should enjoy the story itself. Now, another element which is closely associated with surprise, for example, suspense, is the idea of twists. For example, final twists, or for example, surprise endings, which happen. I'm not really sure about the new, for example, literature books in high schools, but we had a story by O. Henry in our story in which, for example, a couple want to buy Christmas gifts for one another, and then they buy gifts that cancel each other out. And so that was like a surprise ending, right? Or, for example, a surprise ending is when you expected something, but something completely different happened, and it surprised you. So the element of surprise and the twist endings usually happen because we don't know already or in advance what's going to happen next. Because if we know what's going to happen next, well, there is absolutely no suspense and no surprise. So as long as we do not know what's going to happen next, whatever happens can surprise us because we didn't know what's going to happen. However, the level of surprise that we feel is proportional to the unexpectedness of what happens. The more unexpected the event, the more surprised we will feel. And it becomes more significant, it becomes more highlighted in the story when, for example, the surprise ending or when the surprising incident departs radically from our expectations. Because if it resembles our expectations, well, our surprise will be curbed and limited. However, we also have, we said that, well, using surprise in a story needs a lot of care. And for example, careless writers unfortunately use it to a fault, which means that they use it carelessly, and unfortunately, it doesn't really serve any important purpose. But how can we evaluate the effectiveness of surprise? Based on two criteria: fairness of the surprising incident and the purpose that it serves. Now, if the ending that is a surprise ending can turn out to be quite logical upon further inspection, we can say that that surprise ending is justified because it happened fairly. پس بحث fairness یا معیار یا یاردستیک fairness به این میپردازه که اگه یه اتفاقی افتاد که در ابتدا میگی واو من شوکه شدم که همچین چیزی اتفاق افتاد، ولی وقتی دوباره به داستان فکر میکنی میگی آها راست میگه اینجا این سرنخاش بود. اگر در بار دومی که میخونی داستان رو یا وقتی که به داستان داری فکر میکنی ببینی که بله اتفاقا کاملا هم طبیعی بوده و منطقی بوده اتفاق افتادنش، ما میگیم که اون سرپرایز اندینگ بله کاملا افکتیو استفاده شده. And the second the second criterion is the idea of the purpose that a surprise ending serves. If the surprise ending is just there, just to surprise you without any significance, that is a terrible surprise ending. However, the worthwhile surprise, surprising که سرش به تنش بیارزه, is one that creates some form of insight. It illuminates the story even further and tells you about something that you didn't know. Okay? پس سرپرایز اندینگی برای ما قابل قبوله به عنوان کسی که داستان رو تحلیل میکنیم که هم منصفانه اتفاق افتاده باشه بتونیم سر نخاش رو پیدا کنیم و همین که فقط به خاطر غافلگیری نبوده باشه، یعنی مثلا gotcha moment. نه، اینکه خواننده بگه آها دیدی سرت کلاه گذاشتم، به این صورت نه. باید سرپرایزی باشه یا تویستی باشه که یک معنا و مفهومی پشتش باشه که به اصطلاح اون چراغ قوه فیکشن رو به یه جای دیگه‌ای بتابونه که ما یه درک بهتر و جدیدتری از اتفاقات داستان پیدا کنیم. Okay? So when you evaluate a surprise ending in the story, you have to evaluate it based on these two criteria. Okay. Another important element in analyzing the plot is the ending of the story. Now, we have happy endings and unhappy endings. Immature readers, inexperienced readers usually prefer happy endings, in which, for example, the protagonist solves the problem, defeats, for example, the villain or the bad guy, and then, for example, wins the girl, marries the girl, and they live happily ever after. And when you give them a serious story with an unhappy ending, unfortunately, immature readers usually say, hey, this is a depressing story. I don't want it. And then they usually complain and they say that, well, real life itself is depressing enough. I don't want any more depressing stories. Or, quite the contrary, they say that, well, real life is not really this dark. No, real life is even more joyful than what this story is telling me. And so they always prefer a happy ending. However, serious literary writers usually prefer unhappy endings, and for two reasons. And they have two justifications for it. First, they usually say that a lot of the situations in life usually end in unhappy endings. And therefore, if literature wants to imitate life, it must also present the defeat and the failures as well as the triumph. Life is not a series of successes and triumphs. We all know this. All of us have had setbacks in our lives. And so, if literature wants to be a slice of life, it should also portray those unhappy moments and endings. The second justification, which is probably even more important, is that an unhappy ending doesn't, quote unquote, wrap up the story. یعنی هپی اندینگ ها معمولا پایان داستانه. ما دیگه آقا فهمیدیم همه چی به خوبی و خوشی تمام شد، خداحافظ. But unhappy endings force the readers to ponder life, to contemplate life, to think deeply about why life is like this, to think about the unfairness of life, to think about the complications and the complexities of life. پس وقتی که یک داستان حاوی یک هپی اندینگ باشه، تو میگی خب همه چی به خوبی و خوشی تمام شد. پایان داستان پایان خوندن توه. ولی یک داستان ادبی خوب که معمولاً، باز میگم این 100% نیست، نمیشه گفت که همه آن هپی اندینگ ها اینطوری هن. نه، ولی اکثرشون اینطوری هن که وقتی داستان یه جور غم انگیز و تراژیکی هم تموم بشه، ما رو بیشتر به فکر وامی دارن در مورد سختی های زندگی. So that's why a lot of writers prefer unhappy endings. But again, let me tell you, what is important? Is it important really to always write unhappy endings if you are a successful writer? No, absolutely not. You can also write about happy endings, which are good. So what is important to us as literary critics, as students of literature, is the event or the ending being a logical progression, being a logical outcome of what preceded it. چیزی که برامون مهمه اینه که اون اندینگ نتیجه منطقی اتفاقاتی باشه که در قبلش بهش اشاره کرده نویسنده. So what is important to us is whether or not the ending is logical and whether or not it is based on, logically speaking, based on what came before it, what preceded it. Another important thing that the book points out to us is that sometimes we have indeterminate endings. Like, for example, the movies of Asghar Farhadi, we don't really know what happens after the screen turns black. So, or for example, in fiction, sometimes we don't really know what happened. We don't know if, for example, the person killed the other person or not. So these indeterminate endings also appear in literature, but of course, they have to be written carefully because you cannot just stop a story just because you want to have an indeterminate ending. پس این هم اینطوری نیست که بگیم نه من میخوام داستان همینجا یهو متوقف کنم چون دوست دارم پایان باز باشه. نه. باید بالاخره یه منطقی داشته باشه که حالا کتاب راجع به دتیونیکسان فاکنر یه مثال خوبی زده که انشالله بعدا اون داستان رو خواهیم خوند. Another important issue to analyze when you're analyzing the plot of fiction is artistic unity, which is an essential element of every successful plot. The definition of artistic unity is this: there must not be anything in the story which is irrelevant. So, in other words, everything in the story should be completely relevant. I don't know if you have heard of Chekhov's pistol or not. داستان تفنگ چخوف. آقای چخوف که یکی از بزرگترین و شاید بگم بهترین داستان کوتاه نویس های ما هستن، یه جایی اشاره میکنه که الان معروف شده به تفنگ چخوف. آقای چخوف اشاره میکنه، میگه اگر توی داستانی نوشتی که توی توصیفاتت یه جایی اشاره کردی که یه تفنگی روی دیوار نصب شده، نمیتونی همینطوری داستانی یه جوری ول کنی بدون اینکه اون تفنگی یه کاری کرده باشه. یعنی میگه اگه تو میای یه توصیفی انجام بدی از یه تفنگ روی دیوار، قطعاً یه نویسنده خوب به شرطی اون توصیف رو آورده که احتمالاً اون تفنگ قراره در ادامه یه کاری انجام بشه باش، یه کسی باش کشته بشه. So this idea of Chekhov's pistol or gun is related to artistic unity. There must be nothing in the story that is irrelevant, that doesn't contribute to the total meaning. So there should be nothing that is there only for its own sake or for the sake of excitement. No. There should be nothing in the story that does not advance the central intention of the story. In other words, every element of the story should move the story forward. How can we have artistic unity? Good writers have artistic unity because, first, they select. You know that when a writer decides to write a piece of fiction, he has a series of events in his mind, but he doesn't usually write all of those events. He selects them. And that's why this process of selection is important. But even probably more important is the arrangement of those events. همون بحث پلات که گفتیم. هر کسی میتونه مثل تاریخ نگاری یه استوری به تو عرضه کنه، بگه این اتفاقات به این سیر زمانی اتفاق افتادن، اول این، دوم اون، سوم اون یکی. ولی نویسنده خوب نویسنده‌ایه که پلات خوبی می‌نویسه، که ارنجمنت این اتفاقات رو جوری انجام میده که بیشترین افکت رو داشته باشه، بیشترین تأثیر رو داشته باشه. So a good writer uses his abilities to select important events and arrange them in a way for maximum effect. If we have a story which is highly unified, each event grows out of the preceding one in time and leads logically to the next event. In other words, we have causality, cause and effect relationships. So the idea of causality is very, very important for a successful piece of story. Each event should logically stem from the previous event and should logically result in the coming event. So when, for example, when an inexperienced author usually turns the story upside down and, for example, includes something which is not relevant, we say that unfortunately that person is guilty of plot manipulation because, for example, he couldn't logically conclude the story, and so he manipulated it, he changed it in an illogical way so that, for example, he could finish the story. So, unfortunately, those kinds of writers are guilty of plot manipulation. But let's go back to the question I talked about at the beginning of my presentation. Is it enough to just talk about Freytag's pyramid when you want to analyze the plot of the story? Absolutely not, because that's not effective. I'm not saying that you shouldn't do it. No, of course not. I want you to do it, but it's not enough. You should also think about the conflict, the suspense, the surprise, and everything else that we talked about after we finished talking about Freytag's pyramid. So, a good rule of thumb, a good rule to follow is to analyze the plot of the story by focusing on the function of the elements. What function does it serve? What function does, for example, suspense serve? The surprise serve? Okay, so that's important to us. And you have to, in order to do that, you have to analyze the relationship between each event and the total meaning of the work. So what I want you to do when you want to seriously start analyzing literature is always try to find the conflict too, because that is really important. That will tell you what the whole story is about. شما اگه کانفلیکت رو پیدا کنین و مثلا ببینین راجع به یک شخصیت سایکوتیک داریم صحبت میکنیم که مثلا توی ذهنش داره صداهایی میشنوه، حالا این صداها بهش میگن یه کاری انجام بده، میدونین که مثلا یه internal conflict اینجا در جریانه و خب میدونین که حالا تحلیلتون رو باید چطوری انجام بدین. So Finding the conflict is really important. The next thing that you have to do after, for example, you find Freytag's pyramid, you complete the Freytag's pyramid exercise, you have to think about the causal relationships, the cause and effect relationships. Is there causality? Does this event logically stem from a previous event and, for example, leads to for example, the following or the next event or not? You should also think about probability. Are the events probable or they are highly, for example, even impossible? What about unity? Does the writer have artistic unity? Is every element in the story, for example, serving its function correctly? Are there some things which are extras and shouldn't have been included, for example, in the story or not? And then finally, when you do all of this analysis, then of course you have to try to use your analysis to also talk about the total meaning of the work and of course the characters. اصلا تحلیل پلات بدون اشاره به character اصلا یه چیز کاملا ناقصیه. ولی خب چون ما چپتر به چپتر میریم جلو قاعدتاً مجبوریم بعضی وقتا این کارو انجام بدیم. Okay? So for your homework for next session, which will be online next week, I want you to read the story The Japanese Queens by John Galsworthy. I will upload the PDF on the website so that you can download it and read it if you don't already have it. And then I want you to analyze its plot, okay? Our next session will be online. We will have some, for example, Q&A. I will ask the questions and you have to tell me the answer, just like our previous, for example, session. But I want you to analyze the plot of the story. Analyze everything. Try to write or draw Freytag's pyramid for me. Try to, for example, talk about all the other ones: conflict, suspense, surprise, artistic unity, everything, okay? So I want you to analyze the plot of this story and then we will talk about it in our online session next week. So this is the end of session 3. I hope you enjoyed the video and the lecture, and I hope that you learned something too. I will let you know about our next session in the coming days. But this is the end of today's presentation, and I wish you a very good day. Goodbye.